Okie dokie. So if you look at the AMSCO thing here, AMSCO talks about what's known as the Eisenhower years. I'm probably just going to put up some videos that I've already made on the Cold War. You guys got a little bit of that the other day when we talked about, when we did the, showed you the two videos, the Schlesinger videos. You got some of the basics of the Cold War. I do have much longer lessons that I can put up, like 3 early Cold War lectures, along with the, I think, 2 parts for the Korean War, just to make sure that you know everything that you absolutely need to know. But the Schlesinger things, between the video called The Cold War that you guys saw about 10 or 15 minutes of, and the one called Post-War America that you guys saw completely, they hit a lot of the major points. But I may do some more kind of like reviews and stuff to get you guys through that. All right, so on the first page of this AMSCO thing that you see here, they talk about, and I mentioned this, that a lot of people look back at the 50s as happy days. In fact, there was a popular TV series when I was a kid that talked about the 50s and called it Happy Days. Remember, one thing AP likes is for you to be able to find the subtleties, to find the differences. For a lot of people, yeah, it was happy days. To be a white male, and in many cases a white female, was a pretty good time. But for people who were African Americans, especially in the South, there was a lot of racism. We see the beginning of the civil rights movement. For people who were of leftist beliefs, people who were socialist or especially Marxist or communist, it could be also very, very tough, as they faced McCarthyism, and they went after him that way. But, overall, there was a lot of good times for people in here. But at the same time, remember, you've got this nuclear cloud hanging over everything. The fact that in a matter of minutes, because eventually we do develop nuclear missiles during this time that can go intercontinental from Russia to here and vice versa. That was always something in the back of people's mind. And in those videos, you guys saw the duck and cover exercises where kids would get underneath their desk. Now, this is often portrayed as, oh, stupid people, didn't they know that that wouldn't stop a nuclear bomb, that, a desk wouldn't? But really what they were trying to do, besides give people hope that maybe there was a chance to live if there was a nuclear war, was if indeed the blast was far enough and glass or objects were flying through the air from the explosion, this might shield the kids. But there was some interesting things, and I don't think I mentioned this, but talk about kind of eerie. I think it was in Indiana. They actually, in some schools, tattooed kids' blood type on their arm. Now, the purpose of that would be, if necessary, they could, of course, get you the right blood, or I guess use you to get the right blood. Some companies even offered like metal IDs that were guaranteed to survive high temperatures of a nuclear attack. So I guess you could identify the carbonized log that had been your child after a nuclear attack. So like I said, there's some pretty kind of sick stuff going on at the same time. And, and I grew up kind of at the end of this period. And as you'll probably hear me say, I had friends who were like, I'm not even going to bother going to college. Why bother? The world's going to end. There's going to be a nuclear war, and I'm going to be wasting my best years sitting in college. So you had sort of that, kind of going on. So understand that you've got all these good things going on, but this other stuff was always going on as well, too. And AP kind of likes to notice that. Now, you see here on page 579, Eisenhower takes command. Now, Eisenhower, let's go ahead and open up the PowerPoint here and see what we got. Eisenhower's nickname.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like right, I like right, everybody likes I for president. I got the banner, beat the drum, we'll take back to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's have to get in step with us.
Okay, so that's a commercial, and that was used. Now, radio commercials had been done But Eisenhower, he isn't the television president that Kennedy's going to be. And AP likes to ask about kind of that technology and politics, but he will do some of the first commercials, and boy, are they awful. Eisenhower, y'all, is going to dominate the 50s, like it says, like Roosevelt dominated the 1930s and into the 1940s. The slogan, I like Ike. Ike, of course, was his nickname. Eisenhower had been born in Texas, but pretty much raised in Kansas. So he was kind of a Central American. I don't want to say Central American as in like, Nicaragua or something, but he was like a Midwesterner with a lot of those Midwesterner values, accent, all that kind of stuff. Now, the thing about Eisenhower, he was very likable. He had been, and we'll talk about our general during World War II. He had this winning smile. Now, interesting background about Eisenhower, the man. I find him a fascinating person. He had a bad temper, which I can relate to. I have a terrible temper, y'all. In sports, I was always awful about that, and Eisenhower was too. And one time during football, he got really mad, and I think he hit his hand into a tree, broke his hand, right? And from that point on, he realized, I've got to control my temper. And another thing was, he realized if he looked nervous as a commander in war, the other people picked up on that and they acted nervous. So what he learned to do was to have this smile, this, what, me worried? And if he didn't look worried, other people wouldn't be worried. They're like, hey, Ike's okay with it. Things got to be okay. And in a way, he kind of gives that to the American people. And the best thing I can kind of compare him to is kind of like a grandfather. He really felt like a grandfather for a lot of people. All right, so here's his background. There you see him as a general in World War II. Remember, he really had no political experience as far as being elected to anything. He'd never been a governor, a congressman, or anything, y'all. But, of course, there's a lot of politics in being in the military. And ultimately, he'd become the supreme commander of all the Allied forces in Europe. I mean, that's a lot. And that gave him a really great ability to work with different countries, because as you know, in World War II, like in World War I, the United States was part of a big coalition of allies. There were the French to deal with, there were the British, there were Canadians, and especially Russians. There were kind of commanders like Patton who could really get under your skin. And so he really learned the ability to work with people. There might be better, even smarter generals, but there probably was nobody better, y'all, to build up a coalition to work with people. This is, of course, a very famous scene from World War II, right before Normandy, right before the Normandy invasion. He's talking to members of the 101st Airborne who are getting ready to be dropped during the night. Now, his other experience after the war, he was made president of New York's Columbia University. He'd been in charge of NATO. Remember, NATO was created in response to the Berlin airlift in 1949. And the thing is, he was so moderate. How moderate was he? Well, that both parties courted him as a candidate. Republicans said he can be a Republican. Democrats were like, he can be a Democrat. And by that, I mean, so he was kind of moderate. But on economic issues, he seemed to be more Republican, as we'll see. And so he decides to run as Republican, and we see the button there. All right, so we come to the election of 1952, right? And the person running against him is the original egghead. And I think I mentioned last week that my mom was a super big supporter of this Illinois senator and governor, Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson will play a big role during the Cuban Missile Crisis as our ambassador to the United Nations when he calls out Russia and lets them know that, hey, we know that you got missiles here, and look, we got the pictures. But he was always seen kind of as an egghead. In fact, the term egghead was basically coined for him. You see that kind of head. Now, what does that mean? He was intellectual. And I hate to say this about the American people, y'all, but a lot of Americans don't want too smart of a president. It's sort of like, if he's too smart, I'm not going to understand him. I don't know about y'all, but I want the smartest people to be our leaders, not just some average dude. I mean, heck, if that's the case, let's just start drawing names from a bucket or something. And Stevenson, because of his comments, because of his cleverness, he was considered too smart by some people. And so you can see that. He was particularly big, as you can see at the top of page 580 in AMSCO, in fighting McCarthyism, and also liberals liked him, which my mother was. Okay. Now, important to understand here with what was going on. Ooh, that's not coming out very good. Let me fix that. I think I posted it on another background, and the result was, let's see here. It looks like it's showing it with the red background. Let me go through here. It didn't come up on there. All right, let me fix this here, y'all. I don't know why that picture's doing that, but I can probably just show it to you without anything doing that. That shows the box. Why is the box disappearing? Anyway, all right, kind of hard to see, I know, for some of y'all here, but his platform was known as KCC, all right? The first thing he had to deal with was this Korean War, which had started under Truman. And after 2.5 years of this war, y'all, people were getting tired of it. They were getting impatient. And Eisenhower, as a military commander, he made it clear that, look, and his words were, I will go to Korea. But the implication, I will win the war in Korea and get our boys back home. That appealed to a lot of people. And guess what? He did that. Okay. So Korea first. Also, a lot of Americans were worried about communism. Remember, there had been communist spies discovered who'd given some of the secrets to the atomic bomb. Also, the other thing was, there have been communists discovered in the State Department. McCarthyism, as bad as it was based on, some fear that was justified. Of course, they went way overboard. And under Truman, although Truman himself was not corrupt, there were some people working in Truman's administration that were accused of taking bribes and being corrupt. And so basically, he's promising to get the war over in Korea, deal with these communists in the government and abroad, and also fight corruption back home. Okay, now, normally, y'all, we don't talk a lot about vice presidents, except if they eventually do become a president in some way or fashion. Eisenhower is one that we have to, because his vice president, y'all, was at the time, very, very conservative, very anti-communist Californian by the name of Richard Nixon. And as all of you know, I'm sure, Richard Nixon ultimately becomes president of the United States in the late 60s. And sadly and embarrassingly for our country, is our only president to have resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal, his cover up of it and attempt to maybe pay off some of the people and that kind of thing. Now, by the time Nixon becomes president, he's actually moderated. He's moved back to kind of where Eisenhower was, kind of a middle of the road conservative. But the thing is, y'all, when you pick a vice presidential candidate, if you're perceived as a liberal, you try to pick somebody that's considered more conservative, or you pick somebody from a state that you're worried about not winning. They don't always pick, as we would wish, vice presidents who would be like, hey, this man, this woman, they're going to be great if anything bad happens to me. It's often a political choice, and they're just hoping that this guy never becomes president. Well, in fact, because of Eisenhower's bad health, Nixon did have a much bigger role than most vice presidents had. But Nixon was picked, y'all, because Eisenhower was seen as kind of too moderate, kind of too middle of the road. Remember, like I said, Democrats and Republicans both thought he could work for them. And so he picks this conservative guy who had really clear anti-communist credentials. Now, Nixon, y'all, some of his background here. His job was basically, I'll see you there, Xander. Thanks for coming. Good luck today. Make sure Dr. B knows that to let me know how y'all did. I expect y'all to beat Dulles. or at least get second, right? Okay. Anyway, Nixon, y'all, was brought in kind of as the hatchet man, the tough guy. Eisenhower could remain above the fray. Eisenhower could look like a good guy and have Nixon go out and do what they call mudslinging, where you say really nasty stuff and you make accusations. Nixon was had a reputation of being that kind of politician. In fact, he earned the nickname Tricky Dick because of the fact that he did, use some kind of political tricks. Like, for example, I'll just give you one thing. There was a woman running for the Senate in California. Now, she was very liberal. Even a lot of Democrats, like the young John Kennedy, didn't care for her. She probably wasn't a communist, but because she was so liberal, Nixon attacked her as the pink lady. And he said she might not be a red, a communist, but she was at least pink down to the color of her underwear. And that's where he got the nickname Tricky Dick, for using stuff like that. But, and this kind of is foreshadowing, 6 weeks before the election, right, which is nothing, it's discovered that there's a political slush fund. Now, what's a slush fund? A slush fund is money that you have put away for whatever you need it to be. Now, when you and I give money to politicians for their campaigns, it's supposed to be used for the campaigns, not to pay for other kinds of stuff. People allege that this money that Nixon had received gifts or bribes, and it looked bad. And remember, Eisenhower is running under the motto that he's going to stop corruption, Korea, communism, corruption. And it won't look good if his own vice president has this aura of corruption. So Nixon's friends, his own brother, Eisenhower's, they all want him to just drop and pick up somebody, which is usually pretty devastating to a campaign. Nixon was a very ambitious man. He's fascinating. I've read a lot about Nixon and the way he sort of saw the world. But Nixon used a new device, and this would be great, y'all, if you're asked to write about the important role of television, because remember, televisions come out about 5 years or so after World War II, but they're not really seriously big time in people's homes until, the 50s. And most families, y'all, could only afford one black and white TV. Color, y'all, was still in the future to the 1960s. So Nixon uses this new device, which is actually going to have consequences later because he believed he was the master of television. And in an embarrassing speech, he went through and he talked about his family finances and tried to prove to people, I'm not corrupt. I've not taken any money. He went through how much money he owes on his house. They bought a house for his mom. What do they owe on that? And everything like that. And Nixon, y'all, man, he knew how to get you, because he finally ends it with what gives the speech its nickname, the checker speech. Because what he says is, look, we've not taken any money. We've not done this. And he goes, oh yeah, that's right. There is one little gift that we did take. Person from Texas sent us a dog, a little Cocker Spaniel. And my daughter, Trisha, 6 years old, she just loved it. She named it Checkers. And no matter what you guys say, we're not going to give Checkers back. And so everybody's like, no, don't take the dog away from the little girl. That'd be wrong, And so the speech has become known as the Checker speech. Let's see if it plays here. I think I've got it on up here. It says, no matter what, I'm going to not take the dog. So people forgot everything else. And here is Checkers, by the way. And here's little Trisha. She's a little bit older by this point. They're out in Long Island, I think. And this is Checkers today. Checkers has his own tombstone, and he's buried in a pet cemetery. All right, here we go.
It was not a secret. As a matter of fact, when I was on Meet the Press, some of you may have seen it last Sunday, Peter Edison came up to me after the program, and he said, Dick, what about this fund we hear about?
What about this fund, the slush fund?
About it, go out and see Dana Smith, who was the administrator of the fund. Right?
So he just talks about it here. I'll got to speed up to save some time. All right, and here.
We took him. What did we
He even had his wife sitting there, and later Pat, his wife, was so embarrassed by the fact that he went through literally every dime that they had, how small their bank account was, how little their house was.
First of all, we've got a house in Washington,
See,
which cost $41,000. And
that's a pretty expensive house back in the day.
we have a house in Whittier, California, which cost $13,000.
So he goes through and he explains all of that. And like I said, he does mention the fact that he has this dog. And I'm going to kind of move on here, but it is kind of funny. So remember, y'all, the checker speech. This is the first time probably television played a big role in elections. And also, as I said, it's going to give Nixon this kind of inflated idea about how good he is at TV. And when John F. Kennedy in 1960 challenges Nixon to the first presidential debates ever, and on TV no less, Nixon's like, what, me? Checkers Nixon? You're going to challenge me to a TV speech? You're on, right? And of course, Kennedy blew him away, and it cost Nixon the election as president.
In the history.
All right. And he was even talking about this, which is a whole other thing. And people sent in telegrams. They accepted this. And as a result, Eisenhower kept Nixon on the ticket. Had he not, I don't know if Nixon could have really recovered, and we would have had him as a president. And though Nixon, in my lifetime or my childhood, Nixon was looked down upon as a disastrous, terrible president because of the whole Watergate scandal. Now that some years have passed, and when we look at the 70s, we'll talk about this, some people who can put the Watergate scandal aside have found some real positives that he did accomplish as far as foreign affairs particularly. And he turned out to be a fairly conservative, some people said, you know, the best Democrat, even though he wasn't a Democrat president, of the 1960s and 70s as far as some of the stuff he accomplished. Now, I'm going to show you a commercial here because Eisenhower was our first president, y'all, to do TV commercials. All right, I don't know what's going on about there. I'm going to go, hey, how you doing? We got one whole person here.
Good job.
But I'm sending it out anyway online. So, here we go.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. I got the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Harry to do that big job right.
See, those symbolize the Democrats, right? And one of the commercials, the one I hope to show, shows Eisenhower answering questions. Now, Eisenhower, y'all, he wasn't legally blind, but he was doggone close, and he had to wear glasses. But he thought glasses made him look kind of like a wimp, too much like an intellectual. So he didn't like wearing them unless he really had to read something. So they made cue cards for him, and they prepared answers, and they held them up. I mean, the letters were like this big in a gym, and then he read those. They filmed that. Then they had people that they hired to ask the question, and then they cut those together. So it looked like Eisenhower was answering questions from these people. And I mean, it's so corny the way he answers the questions because he wasn't a natural speaker or anything. But remember, once again, television being used in this election. So he's the first to really use this new medium of television to campaign effectively, to reach voters. And it probably played a role in his victory. So in 1952, and you can just remember the 1956 election is basically a replay, y'all. In fact, Adlai Stevenson runs against him in 1956 as well. Nixon wins by he wins by a landslide, just like the song. And you can see here, I mean, the blue, y'all, in those days, blue represented, I need to change and update these slides, but in those days, y'all, blue represented Republicans. Today, red Republicans, blue Democrats, blue state, red state, you know, all that stuff. And so if you look at this here, you'll see, for example, that he Nixon, I mean, not Nixon, but Eisenhower and Nixon carried almost the whole country. The only thing that Eisenhower didn't win was what we called the Solid South, which had been voting Democrat, y'all, ever since the Civil War, right? Ever since Reconstruction. They were so angry at Republicans. And to Eisenhower's credit, and this is a sign of what's going to happen in the 70s with Nixon and what's going to happen even to Kennedy in some cases, but definitely by the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is going to flip the South, right? A lot of your Southern Democrats are going to become disenchanted with the liberal Democratic Party, and they're going to become Republicans, something that their grandparents would have freaked out about. And if you look, Eisenhower won Texas. He won Oklahoma. He won Tennessee. He won Florida. He won Virginia. And this was a big, big kind of shock that the Democrats were starting to lose their most dependable constituency. Remember, Southerners, white Southerners, y'all, were what we know as yellow dog Democrats. They would vote for a yellow dog as long as it was a Democrat yellow dog, right? That's how devoted they were. And as you can look at the numbers here, Eisenhower got 531 electoral votes. You only need 270 to win. He got, 55% of the vote. He beat him by 11%. Now, that's a whopping. That's a serious butt whopping. And it shows you how popular he was and how unpopular Adlai Stevenson was. Just to mention here, this is his wife. Really, really sweet lady. They got married during World War I in 1918. I love that haircut. And this lady, y'all, she was crazy about pink. Literally, everything in the White House was painted pink. Her outfits were pink. So just imagine this is probably pink with pink pearls and everything like that. But that haircut, man, that's bizarre, right? Look at that haircut. It reminds me of somebody who oh my gosh. Yes, it reminds me of Princess Leia. All right. Now, an important concept you guys need to know, shown on page 580 here, underneath domestic politics, okay? Eisenhower, y'all, was famous, as we'll see, for delegating authority. In the military, you can't possibly do everything. In generals, they have to assign different people and trust people to do their jobs. And Eisenhower did that probably more than any president in memory, giving that. Also, the people that he had work in his cabinet were professional business people, like people who'd worked for General Motors car company and stuff like that. He also did not hire the intellectuals like Eisenhower. Like Roosevelt. Roosevelt had what was called the Brains Trust, all these professors from colleges. Eisenhower went more with your average, successful business people, like they mentioned the General Motors guy, and I'll show you a quote there too. So Eisenhower, y'all, was the first Republican president we had had since Herbert Hoover, who lost power because of the Great Depression. So it had been 20 years since we had had a Republican in office, and a lot of changes had happened. Remember, Franklin Roosevelt and Truman had carried out the New Deal and the Fair Deal. And this had greatly changed America by making the government much more involved in people's lives and everything like that. And there was an expectation among your more conservative Republicans that Ike would roll back. He would repeal a lot of FDR's and Truman's, what they thought of as creeping socialism, socialist type policies. One of the things, people wanted him to get rid of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which provided cheap electricity and built a bunch of dams in the Tennessee River Valley, which is what TVA stands for. But the thing is, Eisenhower was a realist. Eisenhower knew that a lot of these policies were very popular with Americans. They had gotten used to things like Social Security. They had paid their money in, and they expected when they retired at 65 to get that money back. Or the fact that when they were unemployed for a brief time, the government would pay to take care of them somewhat until they could find a new job. Roosevelt realized, if I get rid of those popular policies, Republicans are never, ever going to get elected. And this does point to a problem that we do have when the government gets magnanimous and starts giving stuff like this. And some people say, well, this is just a temporary thing. The problem is, once people kind of get used to these, and I don't want to call them handouts because people pay their money in and that kind of thing. But once people get used to these government, what we call transfer payments, you kind of have to keep it going, right? It's hard to stop that. So Eisenhower disappoints some of his more conservative people, but in their mind, he was better than having Truman or Stevenson in there. So he keeps the New Deal. He pretty much leaves everything intact, and so you definitely can consider him somewhat a moderate conservative. If you read that in there too, he extended Social Security. He didn't just keep it. He even raised the minimum wage. He built more public housing, that is cheap, affordable housing. He even picked a woman. The first time a Republican had picked a woman, her name was Oveta Cope Hobby. And by the way, that is the family that Hobby Airport, just a few miles from here, is named after. Okay? But he didn't like the idea of health care, like Truman had wanted, federal health care, or the government getting involved in education. So people call him a modern Republican, not old school. All right. And more about it here. So you don't need to write all this down, but or any of this actually, but he wanted to cut the budget. And I don't know why I've got that playing here. Okay, here we go. Oh, I know why. That's a famous speech. I'd kind of forgotten that speech. Okay. This is his, one of my favorite speeches of his. In fact, I even have it up on the wall up there. This is his like cross of iron speech. And it's a beautiful speech because in it, he talks about what one weapon costs. The building of one bomber, you can build X number of schools. The building of, 50 tanks or something, you can build X number of libraries. And he talks about how we need to cut government spending. But he was famous for supporting big business. And also, and this is important to understand too, this has become kind of a modern Republican thing. Reagan especially favored this. Nixon did as well. Trump as well. The idea is a lot of the things that you and I expect the federal government in Washington, D.C. to do, they favor sending that back to the states. We might take money in from all the states, but then we're going to send that money back to the states because the idea is the state government and local government know better than we do in Washington, D.C. what they need. So rather than us tell them, here's money for this project, we're going to go ahead and trust you to use that money. And that's a very Republican idea, whereas Democrats tend to believe that, look, we're going to take the money in and we're going to investigate and we're going to figure out what's best for your state. And also remember, even though he didn't get rid of the New Deal, he was worried about any more of that kind of stuff. We hear the term creeping socialism. And so he tried to downsize government, to make it smaller. He didn't like big government, the cost of big government, and he got rid of lots of government employees. He laid them off, which probably didn't make them very happy, but definitely cut down the cost. Like I said, millions of more Americans now were eligible for Social Security, like farmers, for example. And he did accept that things had changed. No longer could our government not have anything to do with the economy. Remember, I think I mentioned last time that under before the Great Depression, many people saw government as just something that built roads and did the post office and defended us if we got attacked. And if an economic calamity, a depression or something happened, we just, it was bad luck. It was like a hurricane or something. Hey, this stuff happens. But with the Great Depression and the New Deal, the government now was believed to have an obligation to help people, to have responsibility when people lost their jobs, to keep the economy going, to make sure that we have high employment and low unemployment. And so Eisenhower, like I said, he was a realist. Things had changed in those 20 years. And as I mentioned before, this is kind of suggesting what Nixon's going to become famous for, this new federalism, what Reagan is going to become famous for the next decade. Not so much the Bushes, maybe Bush too, but Trump as well. This idea that it's not the job of the federal government to tell states what to do with the money. We'll take the money in, we'll redistribute it, and you know what's best. Also, much like Reagan wanted to cut government spending, at least in a lot of big bureaus, although, and in some ways, Eisenhower did plow a lot of that money back into the military, despite his cross the iron speech, but still. All right, and it's kind of interesting here, but this kind of gives you an insight to Eisenhower's mind. I'll be conservative, in spending money, in money matters, but a liberal when it comes to people, right? That kind of thing. All right, now I've already mentioned this just a little bit, more information than you probably need to know, but Eisenhower, as a supporter of big business, did not have the intellectuals, the brain trust that Roosevelt had. He picked basically successful businessmen. The idea is if you can be successful in business, you can probably be successful in government service. But this makes a lot of people kind of believe that, well, if the business people are helping the president, they're going to be making decisions that only help big business. And this is a very famous quote you guys might want to write down, just because some people believe it kind of encapsulates this idea of government and business working together. The real quote is, what's good for the country is good for General Motors and vice versa. This was said by his Secretary of Defense. What is good for our country is good for General Motors and vice versa. The critics took this, and the way they took it, they said it was what's good for General Motors is good for America. Now, that's not exactly what he's saying here. He's basically saying, look, what we do that helps the country is also going to help General Motors. And if General Motors is doing well, the country is doing well. General Motors, of course, is the car company that controls like Buick and not Ford, but Buick and they do Buick, Cadillac, Chevrolet, a bunch of our car companies. And so if you see that what's good for General Motors is good for this country, remember, it's not exactly true, but that's how a lot of people saw Eisenhower, as basically favoring big business, championing big business, and all of that. Now, perhaps the biggest criticism of Eisenhower was the fact that he seemed not to be working as president that much. He seemed to be kind of taking it easy. Some Americans saw him as kind of a lazy, hands-off president. And my father, I know, was one of these people who greatly criticized Eisenhower because it seemed like every time he saw him, Eisenhower was playing golf, or he was out fishing, or he was out hunting. When did he have time to even be president? And so that was a real criticism of it. Another thing is Eisenhower's health was a real issue as well, too. Eisenhower was a big smoker. He'd always smoked. And as a result, he had numerous heart attacks. Seven heart attacks in his life, y'all. And also he'd had major stomach surgery while president. He's almost kind of like this guy. This is from Sanford and Son, popular 1970s TV series.
I've never had pain like this before. Oh, this is the worst one I ever had, son. Oh, it's the worst one. This is a big one. I'm dying. You get out of Elizabeth.
Elizabeth's ex-wife, good wife. I'm coming to join you, honey.
Hey, man, Elizabeth.
So that character, Fred Sanford, would always fake heart attacks when he wanted to get his way. Well, Eisenhower didn't have to do that. Ironically, by the way, that comedian who made fun of heart attacks died of a heart attack. And so, yeah, karma, y'all. You know what they say about it. All right. So as a result, y'all, here you see him golfing, you see him fishing, you see him hunting. And because of his illness, the fact that he spent weeks in the hospital, Nixon had to be president. We didn't have the 25th Amendment yet that formally turned over the presidency, but to the vice president for a while. But Nixon had to fulfill the role. So Nixon, y'all, is really going to kind of feel like, hey, I've already kind of been president for a while. Why don't you guys in 1960 just make it formal? Now, understand, though, historians often engage in revisionism. Historians, years later, go back and they look at things and they make different conclusions, sometimes based on released documents, like from the Eisenhower Library, which I did some work at one summer a few years ago. Some historians look back and they say, this was just show. Eisenhower did this to make people feel like everything was okay. He went out and played golf and like, look, man, things are great. But secretly behind the scenes, he was running things. They call it the hidden hand presidency. You didn't see him all the time meeting his cabinet. You didn't see him going out and making policy or things, but he didn't let anything happen that he didn't know about, right? And one of these is going to come up with the U-2 situation. The U-2 was a surveillance spy plane that got shot down over Russia in 1960. And Khrushchev, the Russian leader, tried to give Eisenhower an out. If Eisenhower would just admit that he didn't know about this flight, that it was some crazy guys in the CIA or in his own government that did the flight, he would go ahead and have that meeting in Paris that ended up being canceled, the Paris Arms Summit. But Eisenhower couldn't do that. That would look awful. It would look like, well, I didn't even know we were doing this. And when I was working at the Eisenhower Library, one of the things I found in my U-2 research, I mean, it's there, it's not hard to find, but the actual document where Eisenhower signed off on that U-2 flight. He knew it, obviously. They even had a cover story for it that we also have in the museum. So a lot of people believe he wasn't, that he was actually much more involved. So that's something that sometimes comes up. There you see him fishing, okay?
Give me my money, Lord. I said no.
Okay, so anyway, I'm going to skip the little thing about Sherman Adams here, except just to mention that he was kind of Eisenhower's liaison with Congress. Rather than the president himself talking to congressmen, doing all that dirty kind of miserable work. You know what they say about, looking how politicians do things. It's kind of like watching sausage be made. If you ever see sausage being made, you don't ever want to eat it again. And so watching how politics is done is kind of apparently just as gross. And Eisenhower didn't do it. Instead, he left Sherman Adams to be his chief of staff and to do all that. All right, now if you look at the bottom of page 580 here, we see Eisenhower's greatest accomplishment. And this is definitely something to be on your STAR test, as well as Eisenhower's greatest accomplishment, one that you and I use probably nearly every day. Yes, we built highways, hopefully not to hell, though. Now, Eisenhower, y'all, when he had been in occupied Germany during World War II at the end of the war, and even when he had led a group of Americans to travel across the nation, he realized the important need to have highways. Now, Hitler had become famous, for building what were called the Autobahns. The Autobahns were the modern day highways, and they're still in Germany today. I was on one back in, 2016 when I was over there. There's no speed limit. We were doing easily 110 miles an hour on the road, y'all, because you just drive whatever speed. But of course, you're a lot more cautious, obviously, when you're going at those kind of speeds. And so he wanted these highways. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, because what they would allow, y'all, is, of course, us to be able to get, our food, to get things all around the country in a very, very quick way. But also, there was an ulterior motive. If we go to war, we're going to need to be able to move men and equipment quickly across the nation, to wherever it needs to be. We even set up a thing, y'all, that the overpasses had to be big enough so that trucks with missiles could go underneath them. That was the minimum height of the overpasses. We also set a situation where every so many miles, you had to have a very long straightaway that could be used if necessary as an airfield, because that's what the Germans had done in World War II. They used the Autobahn towards the end of the war as airfield. This was a big, big government expenditure. $32 billion, probably about $240 billion today, $250 billion. You'll see some different numbers. This says 41,000 miles. Your reading says 42,000 miles. If you just remember more than 40,000 miles, that's more info than anybody would ever expect. Now, these new highways, y'all, also had some other consequences. Remember, the 50s are famous for their suburbs. And so this is one thing that they did. Now that people had highways, and I'll show you one that you might recognize here in just a sec, these highways, y'all, are going to hurt the cities because people are going to leave the cities, or maybe they might, what we call the donut effect, they might live outside the city, and then during the daytime they would go and work in the city, and then at nighttime they would leave. So it's sort of like the city became like empty, like a donut. The other big consequence is our railroads really kind of got the shaft. Because of all this money going into the highways, companies started using trucks, 18-wheelers, right, to carry our goods and services. And we still rely on them a lot. And the railroads really began to deteriorate, especially passenger car railroads. By the 60s and the 70s, you just don't see people riding the railroads. Why? I can hop in my car and drive and not have to deal with that. Unlike, in Europe and places like that where people depend on it. Now, this is the Gulf Freeway in 1956, y'all. The very first attempt to do it. I highly predict the Gulf Freeway will be finished when your grandkids are finished paying off their college loans. I think that's how soon it will be. They've always been working on what we call the Gulf Freeway or I-45. I'm not exactly sure where this is. Looks like it's kind of close to downtown, but it's the Gulf Freeway, I-45, that you and I take. That is an example of this highway act as well. Americans can now rock down the highway. All right, 1956 election is basically a repeat, right? There. And also, I didn't talk about it, but on page 581, prosperity. Remember, we talked a lot last time about the prosperity of the Eisenhower administration and that inflation, 1.5%, that's almost nothing. The budget, the government, Eisenhower's cost cutting, y'all, meant that we actually, 3 years out of 8, we had a surplus. We spent less money than we took in. And so many people see him as a very economically successful president. We mentioned too, families had twice as much income. Now, in 1956, the rematch, as you can see here, is basically the same. And even more people, y'all, even more people now. He won Louisiana. He won Tennessee. He won West Virginia. He won a lot of these states. But an interesting thing here that sort of points to what's going to happen in the 60s and the 70s is you see here that one person, one delegate, one elector, and I believe in Mississippi, chose to vote neither Republican nor Democrat. Now, what's beginning to happen is some of your white conservatives in the South are starting to get nervous about the civil rights bills. They're starting to think the government's getting into an area that they thought it shouldn't be in. And you'll see this happen more where you start seeing some of these more conservative Democrats starting to back away. They wouldn't quite go Republican, all of them yet, but they definitely were willing to not vote Democratic, largely because of what they thought was government overreach, federal government overreach in issues like civil rights and stuff. Okay, so Eisenhower and the Cold War. I have a separate video on this that I can put up for you guys. We'll talk about the beginnings of the war in Vietnam, the end of the war in Korea. We'll talk about the Middle East and the Suez Crisis and some of that with y'all. That's a whole separate thing.